Boardroom Bound, episode 127, How Military Experience Creates Global Mindedness in the Boardroom with Phil Breedlove.
If you really want to know what I think, it's not about the senior leaders. It really isn't. It's about the teams that they lead. And the really great senior leaders are not about self-aggrandizement. They're about the team and the team success.
Hello, and welcome to this episode of Boardroom Bound. My name is Alexander Lowry, and this is the podcast dedicated to intentional leadership in the boardroom. My goal is to give aspiring existing directors the tips, tactics, and strategies necessary to transform your confidence and build a successful career as a board director. Quick reminder, you can get all of today's show notes at podcast.gordon.edu. And today is one of those special episodes for me where a few times a year with several of our holidays, I get to honor our service veterans. And today we have a retired Air Force 4-star general who served for 39 years. Phil Breedlove is one of the people who is at the highest levels you could possibly imagine in the command, right? So he at one point was the number 2 guy in the Air Force. He was also the Supreme Allied Commander of Europe. It doesn't get much higher than this. Like, these are the guys you picture with the beautiful gleaming uniforms with all the medals on them who are serving and leading all of the soldiers. And of course, when you think about leading Europe, well, he might be an expert on NATO, and he might be an expert on Russia and fun places like that we might talk about in today's episode that are so topical. So it is an honor for me today to be able to honor some of our service veterans and hear from one of their biggest and best leaders. Let's jump into the show. Phil Breedlove, welcome to the Boardroom Bound podcast.
Well, thanks for having me. I look forward to our conversation.
Well, it is an honor and a privilege for me to have someone of your caliber, your history, and your ilk on the show. This is an honor that I have at least 3 times a year with some of our holidays, Memorial Day, 4th of July, Veterans Day, to be able to share stories like we're going to talk about with you, Phil, today, where I'm going to translate this for our audience. You were leading multi-billion-dollar organizations, 2 of them in parallel, and what that looks and feels like from someone to move from the highest ranks of the military and the skills you bring into the private sector afterwards. And I want to start, as we begin today, we need people to understand what that looked like from your career in the military, and we'll help translate that across for how it looks and feels. But also, this is meant to honor our service members and their families who've sacrificed so much as part of those careers, for people listening to realize, wow, the value that they would bring to my organization. So, Phil, you've had an illustrious military career, so perhaps you can set that what that looked and felt like for you.
Well, first of all, it was an honor to serve. And early in my life, I was doing something that I absolutely loved. For the first 2/3 of my career, I was flying the F-16, and I got to lead the men and women who did that at all levels, from squadron to group to 3 wing commands to a numbered Air Force command to a major command, etc. And so the first part of my life, while there was a lot of hard work, it was a lot of fun. And what happened there is the military just kept preparing me for the next bigger job, the next level of responsibility, starting off with a squadron of about 340 and then ending up in commands that had hundreds of thousands. And so I was well prepared for what happened in the last third of my life, which basically you're less about flying and fighting, and you're more about leading those that do. And as you move into that phase of your life, as you become a general officer and move up in the ranks, you are ever more plugged into large organizations and groups of exterior customers, such as countries, 53 countries in my European command and 28 countries plus 23 partners in my command as the NATO commander. And so you add to your repertoire a little bit of a diplomat. You have to be a diplomat. You have to be a leader of a board. You have to be a military commander. So it's really an interesting combination that becomes the end of a 40-year service.
And it's interesting to translate that across. So people would probably hear one of your senior titles and, Vice Chief of Staff to the Air Force. It sort of almost sounds like back to that Seinfeld George Costanza, assistant to the traveling secretary. But that's not what it was. It doesn't get too much more
That's
senior than
funny.
that, right?
Yeah, the vice chief is actually an interesting and tough job. So you are the number two general in the Air Force. There's a chief of staff who is the boss, and you're the vice. And it's like so many number twos in organizations, you get a lot of the hard and dirty jobs that you have to slug through. And I must tell you that what happened to me in as the vice chief of staff of the Air Force was during what you may or may not know or remember called the Budget Control Act time and the threat of sequestration.
Mm-hmm.
And I was in charge of removing $54.7 billion with a B, billion dollars from the Air Force budget. And that was two of the hardest years in my Air Force career.
And of course, that's good context. When you think about the Air Force, this is a tens of billions of dollar organization with hundreds of thousands of employees. We just have to put this on the scope of some of the largest corporations, if that's what it was.
Yeah, this was an interesting thing. And as you know, and I say this not in jest, but in statement of fact and also in respect. Our board of governors numbers 535.
Right, that's Congress.
100 senators and the rest representatives. And so you have a very diverse board that you have to answer to in your work.
That's a lot of stakeholder management. And it didn't get any easier when you were the Supreme Allied Commander of Europe, right? Because now you had a lot more cultural differences of the people you were referring to.
Yeah, so NATO, again, also a privilege to lead it. It's interesting when they asked me to be the commander of NATO, I was probably the most experienced general in the U.S. forces, Army, Navy, Air Force, and Marines, having had 8 assignments in Europe from when I was a very young man to a very senior man. 2 daughters born in Germany, among other things. And so leading that group, as you say, a very diverse group, and trying to build consensus in a consensus-driven organization was an interesting way to finish out my career.
And you were number 17, and we probably all remember number 1, which was Eisenhower during World War II, right? So that is an incredibly important role, and especially the way the world has grown and changed. And we could talk probably the whole episode about the complexity around it, but I would love to give this little nugget for our audience. So when you think about your job over in Europe, in many ways, I would say the big 800-pound gorilla next door that you're probably talking and spending a lot of time on is Russia. And we have seen Russia in the news again now, and maybe we should argue it never should leave the news. But clearly when we think about, Phil, you as a calling card, when an organization who might think, oh, I have international opportunities, or I want to be in Russia, or I am in Russia, I imagine you are on the calling card list for a lot of people, certainly the news organizations these days. So what does it look and feel like? And let's use that as a beginning point to translate across as you left the military. When you think about opportunities coming forward for you, I imagine that was a piece of it.
It certainly was. And just to sort of set the stage, my tour as the SACEUR began in the summer of 13, and at the time, President Obama was working a major drawdown of forces in Afghanistan, and I thought that, being the NATO commander of operations in Afghanistan, I thought that was going to be, the centerpiece of my tour as the SACEUR. But little did we know that fall of 13 and the spring of 14, Russia would invade twice Ukraine. We thought that, major world powers and struggle on the continent of Europe was over after World War II. But here we have Russia using its armed forces to change internationally recognized borders on the Eurasian landmass. And so that then, of course, drove the latter 2.5 years of my tour is how did we, the United States, and how did we, NATO, respond to Russia invading Ukraine twice and seizing and holding land that they still hold today. And if you've been watching the news at all over the last couple of weeks, you've seen them do another similar buildup in military forces to what they did when I was commanding native. So what that did do, as you pointed out, is it drove me into a particular set of concerns and negotiations and high level groups from State Department to think tanks to ambassadors, etc., that have tried to deal with Russia since that time, and it has dominated my post retirement employment, which still is in many ways centered on what is happening in Europe.
Now, Phil, for our audience listening, I'm sure that we can all recognize, okay, this is important militarily. I can see how this is something that our government leaders are very concerned about. I want to directly translate this across, and we don't even have to use Russia, right? So we can imagine how the world we saw during the pandemic, right? How the supply chains blew up and everything that we'd planned for just in time changed so much. We've seen so much move over to China over the last few decades. China, of course, is continuing to flex its muscles militarily, politically, etc. And most every country in the world has some sort of supply chain related to something like that. Or we could talk about how, the pirates off the coast of Africa or Iran threatening the coastal waters of ships trying to move through. I want to make this very clear for every organization around the world. You are impacted by what other countries are doing, even if you're not in that country. And Phil, I imagine, and I would love for you to talk about this, that is probably translated well into the boardrooms of many organizations going, we probably need at least one person sitting around this table that can give us insights into something like that. We can picture any multinational company, whether it's FedEx or Coca-Cola, something like that, who would be impacted by something. Can you give us a sense of what that actually looks and feels like for those sorts of discussions that are happening?
Well, it's extremely real. So the bottom line is, so many of our corporations. I mean, for your audience, this is like preaching to the choir. But for so many of them, we are completely internationally connected. And not only do we have supply chain items coming from our international connections, but we are building product overseas as a part of our business. And I'm not just talking about TVs. We have some of our most sophisticated aircraft being assembled in Italy. And so these things have grown from a period which I think was good following the fall of the wall in Europe. But what we have found is there are some entanglements that haven't worked out so well for us. We went through a period where we were, I call it, hugging the bear, trying to bring Russia closer to Western values, Western morals, and Western business practices, et cetera, et cetera. And now what we find is that some of those connections with Russia, some of those connections with China have not played out the way we had hoped and invested behind. And even inside our friendships, we are finding some problems. I think the examples most recently with Turkey and some of the very high-end things that we were going to be doing with Turkey. And because of the way Mr. Erdogan is leading that country, those things now have collapsed. And so it is about supply chains, but sometimes it's far bigger than supply chains. It's end items in production in places. And it is a constant concern as we invest overseas.
And it's probably easy for the public to lose sight of certain topics. The theory is if it bleeds, it leads on the news, right? So it's a shame all the horrible stuff we see, but that's what draws us in. And if the world goes quiet in a certain spot, we might forget about it. But that doesn't mean the organizations, the companies are forgetting about it, because they're planning not just for today and tomorrow, but for the longer term. If they're going to build a new plant somewhere, how do they make the calculated decisions around it? So you are constantly needing an expert on the various topics, whether it's cyber or supply chain or geopolitical risk, whatever it might be, sitting there. And Phil, help us tie this back more generally now to some of our senior leaders. Like, we can all picture the Joint Chiefs of Staff sitting there in their uniforms with all the medals and the 4 stars on their shoulders. And that is the upper echelon of you were sitting in that group of, there are so few of them, right? But I would broaden that to say anyone who's leaving with a star on their shoulder is probably someone who has incredible leadership and passion and integrity and decision-making skills. And let's just share with our audience for a minute how they can imagine some of these incredible and distinguished leaders translating from, say, the first half of their career when they leave the service and moving over into the private sector, and what that looks and feels like.
Well, it's interesting. I have moved into the private sector myself with a large corporation, a small corporation, and I'm leading a small think tank, and I'm teaching at my alma mater at Georgia Tech. But here's what I would say. Many people think of these very senior military people as, their skill set is war and the things around war. And certainly all of them, or us, if you will allow me, bring that skill to any table. But here is the thing that many don't understand. As I mentioned before, these senior officers in the latter third of their careers are as much diplomats as they are soldiers, sailors, airmen, and Marines. And what we have had to master is that our country has more tools or more capabilities than the military. I use a very simple model. I call it DIME, D-I-M-E, because it's something that people will remember, especially people in boardrooms, as it's a coin. And that DIME is all of the elements, a very simplified model of all of the elements of national power. Diplomatic power, informational power, military power, and economic power. And as you move into the senior ranks of the military, you are forced to now deal in all of these realms because your opponents do. When Russia attacked Ukraine, there were incredible diplomatic, disinformational, and economic tools they used, as well as the military forces to attack on the ground. And so what you have in these senior leaders are people who have had to think at much more of an all of government or all of nation capability to respond to challenges, whether they be in the military or in what you might cover in a boardroom. So I would just offer that these folks, yes, they got a chest full of medals and they got shoulders full of stars, but they are far broader than just the military tool.
And I imagine when we look at the headlines, I'd love your perspective on this, Phil. We see time and again where organizations, boards, individual leaders, we'll just say, have let us down and had made poor decisions. And when you think about diversity that's happened in the boardroom, that discussion that's moved over the last decade or two, it began really with gender diversity, which we could see in a photo. It's now moving more towards racial and ethnic, global perspectives. I would certainly say military is a key part of that. And I think generally our minds go to places like the defense sector or aerospace, Raytheon, Boeing, places like that where people go, oh, there's no question we want military leaders in those. But I imagine any organization, so my prior company, JP Morgan, having someone like yourself who would sit on the board who can say, well, here are some implications we would consider about what we're doing here that might impact something over there. Or we're going to see this happening over the next few years in this space, and that might impact us over here. Think about how cryptocurrencies are going to change. If China, for example, brings out their own cryptocurrency, they're going to have 1 billion people that take it up right away. They'll probably put it onto all their the belt and countries that are taking up the money from them, and suddenly all of those people are using their currency. Changes whether they're a currency that the entire world uses. It changes really quick. So I imagine you get companies that are sort of tapping you on the shoulders going, at the very least, Phil, we need to pick your brain about some sort of stuff. But you're probably similar in that regard to other people leaving the military who just have thought in a very different way. Is that fair?
I'm not totally sure it's fair, but let me just sort of amplify some of those thoughts, and then you can judge it. So even though we see some interesting headlines now as it relates to Washington, D.C. and the latest ugliness there, I would assert to you the following. The military has done a good job over the years at getting out in front of and leading some of these societal changes. And it's not all just on the greatness and the goodness of the military. It's also because of the oversight of Congress pushing us forward in these diversity issues of gender and racial diversity. And so the combination of the people that we are, the combination of the oversight from Congress, and frankly, when you get on a battlefield and there's people to your left and right, you're not very concerned about what gender or race they are. You're just concerned that they have the skills to hold up the flank on your left or right. And so we are much more about team, and that allows us not to be perfect. We're far from perfect, but that allows us to better address some of these challenges because we are all about team. And so I'm pretty proud, frankly, about how the services, and especially my service, the Air Force, has gotten after these. Back in 1978 and 79, we had the first females in pilot training. Oh, by the way, that was the same time I was going through pilot training. And I have watched our female pilots and officers, brothers and sisters, addressing what we do in airplanes. And I've seen the incredible capability of young ladies and female officers in the fighter force. I flew with two that I talk about all the time who were absolutely superior, steely-eyed killers in their fighter airplanes. And this is, I think, a testament to what we've done. And we've come a long way when it comes to racial diversity, but we've got a ways to go yet. We are a subset of society, and we still have things we have to address. But I am most proud of what I know is the intent of our services, and that is to move forward, not backward on these issues.
And Phil, that actually brings up a slightly different point in my mind that I'd love for you to comment on. When I think about, say, our military flag and general officers, I imagine people that are calm under pressure, that are still effective no matter what's going on around them. And that's one of the ways they've risen through the ranks, is they're able to be effective in every circumstance. And when I think back to the last year, the world has changed dramatically with the pandemic, and many organizations have struggled to adapt. It's been a challenge for even the ones that have been successful. And I would imagine having someone who has been through different experiences where literally under fire, they've had to make really good decisions. That's the kind of person you probably need around you. You were just talking about looking to your left, looking to your right. Do you see the right people around you? I'd love for you to comment on that. And also, I know the Marine Corps philosophy that's been shared with me of the 70% solution. And don't wait for analysis paralysis. You're going to have to make a decision, go forward. You just talked about not necessarily being perfect, but you need to move forward and you need to do something, do it well. And also with the Marine philosophy of, hey, you celebrate a mistake because you'll never make it again. You've learned from that, and that's okay, and that's part of it. I imagine all of this translates very well into the boardroom, and I'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah, so I had to smile when you talked about being calm. I think you're right in the main, but even the best of us sometimes get a little wound up. It's hard not to, especially when people's lives are at stake. But yes, I think that most great leaders have been able to harness any challenges they had to being calm and then manifest that into focus on what's going on in front of you. It's sort of, yes, we do have fears too. If you step into some of these situations and you don't have a great respect or a little bit of fear for what's in front of you, then I'm not sure that you got your head screwed on totally right. But what you do is overcome that and formulate the right way or the best way you see ahead, and relying on all your training and your leadership experience, and you move out. The answer is not, I quit. The answer is not, we can't. The answer is, move out, make contact with the enemy, and get the mission accomplished. And I think that also, as you were talking about, a lot of soldiers will actually tell you what I was talking about a few minutes ago. I didn't fight for my unit or for this grand mission. I fought for my buddies left and right who were in the fight with me. And it's about that team. And I want my team to succeed and my buddies to succeed. And then the larger team and the larger organization will receive. And then the last thing I would just throw here is, we have a great tradition in the military that I sometimes wonder about the boardrooms. And I would offer this as a big thought. It is a huge deal in the military that you train your replacement. We are all about mentoring and training the people who will lead behind us, and specifically the person that will lead me when I leave. That translates onto the battlefield of training who will be in charge if you fall. Because if the unit fails on the battlefield because you, the leader, were taken from them and you had not trained your successor, then shame on you, because somebody's got to step up to keep the organization moving forward. And so we take a lot of pride in training that person behind us. The whole business of put your hand in a bucket of water and pull your hand out and see what happens. So pretty proud of that sort of pedigree of the military approach to leadership.
I think that is directly translatable. I love the way you describe that. When you think about a board's, we could argue what is their primary role, but let's just say it's this. It's about finding the CEO, hiring them, nurturing them, and at some point replacing them. Perhaps they retired or they passed on, they got fired, whatever it might be. And if you do not have a bench, or at least one person, to your point, who might be able to step up and take care of that. I've seen boards, I've had, friend Cheryl Batchelder twice, who was pulled out of the board, become the interim CEO because they were not ready with someone else when they had to make a replacement. And you could argue maybe that was the fallback plan. But that is incumbent upon the boards to be ready, to be able to handle those sorts of circumstances. So I agree with you. And Phil, let me use that as a transition point. I would love to have your thoughts on this as we think about, say, especially anyone with a star on their shoulders are leaving the military, and they go from, say, that first active life, which has its own acronyms, its own style, its own culture, what someone was very good at it because they got moved up, and they're moving into the private sector. Massive culture change, big adjustment for them. Would love to hear what it has been like for you, what's been most successful, and the advice that you would give to other people following in that path.
Yeah, so there's a couple, and these are a little bit random, but I'll throw a few out there. Probably the biggest change for a military person is moving from someone who works to be the best manager, the most responsible steward of taxpayer money, to moving into a situation where you are driven by a profit motive. In the military, we admit that sometimes we don't do things the cheapest way. When we go to combat, we are worried about being effective. And that sometimes doesn't mean taking the cheapest path. When my sons and daughters, and I have sons and daughters in uniform, when they go to fight, I don't want them worried about the cheapest thing to do. I want them getting their mission done and getting they and their soldiers, sailors, airmen, and Marines home safely. And so there is a little bit of a different approach there. The other thing that I would say is that sometimes in the business world, and this is a little bit of a criticism, people are not as inclined to train and help people left and right at the same echelon because everyone is competing. Now that exists also in the military, but in the military normally the first allegiance is to the mission, because if we don't get the mission done and we lose, it is catastrophic. And so we are a little bit more inclined to help out, train, and bring along those to our left and right so that the whole organization is better served, as opposed to sort of individual competition for those C-suite corner rooms, etc.
Those are both great points, and I can think of some organizations, there's probably far too few, that have the sort of culture you're talking about that we would want to see, right? That sort of more collaborative approach. And there's few and far between. If I think back to my time at JP Morgan, you're talking about not a building full of type A personalities, but uber type A personalities willing to step on you to get up ahead. And To your first point, I can't help but think of NASA, right? The world's most amazing technology built by the cheapest bidding contractor, right? So I agree with both of those points. And, Phil, when I try to think about how we wrap this up today as a special holiday episode, which is appreciation of what you as an individual have accomplished and the value you're bringing back to us, but representative of so many other service members who are sacrificing, and not just themselves, but their families sacrificing so that they can help for the greater good of the mission and our country, I would love to leave the last couple of minutes just for you to have some thoughts to share today.
Well, personal pronouns are important. And you use the term you and you a couple of times in those sentences. If you really want to know what I think as we wrap up, it's not about the senior leaders. It really isn't. It's about the teams that they lead. And the really great senior leaders are not about self-aggrandizement. They're about the team and the team's success. I often ask these leaders as I mentor them now as a civilian, I say, give your own self a personal pronoun test. If when you are dealing with issues out there on your team and all you are saying is I, me, my, and mine, you need to reevaluate. You need to be using we, us, they, team, because that's what it's all about. And in my personal experience, I like to say it this way: take care of your airmen, and your airmen will take care of the mission. And so I think the focus that we have is that we need to have loyalty up to our civilian leadership and our military chain of command. But our real loyalty belongs to those below us and to the left and right of us, because they will make the mission happen. And so a focus on our people and their families and what keeps them moving forward in their lives, that's truly what's going to pay off in your future.
That's it for this episode of Boardroom Bound. I really enjoyed chatting with Phil Breedlove. What an honor to talk to someone who reached the highest levels of military leadership. He was one of only 6 geographical commanders, Supreme Allied Commander of NATO, 39 years of service on active duty. What a perfect guest to have today as we think about honoring our Memorial Day and the people who've sacrificed so much for our country. And of course, this was also directly translatable information for all of us thinking about how we best represent ourselves, how we present the position of authority that we have so that we are an attractive candidate for being in a boardroom. Now remember, if you head over to podcast.gordon.edu, you'll find links to all of today's resources. And please know that the Boardroom Bound team and I are so proud to be your go-to podcast for all things that connect, prepare, and empower you to land a board seat. Be sure to subscribe to this podcast so you don't miss any of the high-quality content that we're bringing to you every Wednesday. Thanks for joining me today. I can't wait to share more stories and strategies from brilliant business minds with you again next week. Remember to keep tuning in to be Boardroom Bound.